The second I stepped through that heavy walnut door, I knew I had just made one of two choices, either the smartest decision of my life or the worst mistake I would ever regret. Linda Harrington's expression twisted into something caught between a polite smile and a quiet wince, like someone forcing a pose after tasting something sour. Her eyes traveled slowly down my simple midnight blue dress, my worn flats, the inexpensive earrings I'd picked up at a drugstore on the way over. I could practically see the math happening in her head, and I didn't pass the test. She leaned toward her son, Daniel, my fiancé, and whispered something she clearly believed I couldn't hear. She looks like the help who wandered in through the wrong door. I heard every word. And in that moment, I knew this dinner was going to be far more interesting than anyone expected. My name is Rachel Moore. I'm 33 years old, and I have a confession. For the past 16 months, I've been hiding a secret from the man I was supposed to marry. Not a harmless secret, not something small or embarrassing. My secret is this: I make just over $24,000 a month. Before taxes, the number raises eyebrows. After taxes, it still makes accountants pause and ask if there's been an error. I'm a principal systems engineer at a large global logistics tech firm based in Toronto. I've been writing code since I was 17. I sold my first product in my early 20s. I hold 2 registered patents. I've spoken at international conferences, and I own equity that would make most people quietly uncomfortable. Daniel, however, believed I was an office assistant, someone barely keeping up with rent. The ironic part, I never actually lied to him. When we met at a coffee shop over a year ago, he asked what I did for a living. I told him I worked in tech. He nodded as if he understood, then casually asked if I handled administrative support for senior executives. I smiled, gave a vague answer about supporting the team, and he filled in the rest on his own. I simply never corrected him. Why would I do that? Why would I let someone I was falling in love with believe I was struggling financially when I could have paid for his car 10 times over because of something I learned from the most important person in my life? My grandmother, Margaret Moore. She raised me after my parents passed away when I was 7. She lived in a modest house on a quiet street, drove an old car, shopped at regular grocery stores, never wore anything flashy. She taught me to cook simple meals, to appreciate small joys, and never ever measure my worth by the number in my bank account. What I didn't discover until she passed away when I was 25 was that my grandmother had been worth several $million. She had built a successful business early in her life, invested wisely, and then chosen to live simply because she believed character mattered more than appearance. She left me everything, along with a letter I still keep in my bedside drawer. In that letter, she wrote something I've never forgotten. A person's true character only shows when they believe no one important is watching, when they think you have nothing to offer them. So when Daniel invited me to dinner at his family's estate in Oak Ridge Hills, when he hinted that the night might be important, when he mentioned that his mother was extremely particular about first impressions, I made a decision. I would give the Harrington family the test my grandmother had taught me. I would show up exactly as they expected. Simple, unassuming, no signs of wealth or influence. I would wear modest clothes, drive my old car, speak humbly about my life. And I would watch. I would watch how they treated someone they believed couldn't help them, someone they thought was beneath them, someone they assumed had nothing to offer. And before you judge me, before you think I was being manipulative, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what your partner's family really thinks of you? Have you ever felt that the smiles were forced, the compliments hollow? Have you ever wanted to know the truth? Even if it might hurt, I wanted to know. Because I wasn't just considering marrying Daniel. I was considering marrying into his family. And families, as my grandmother always said, are forever. Before I go any further, let me pause for just a second. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a moment to hit the like button and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every single one, and knowing people are listening from all over the world at every hour of the day means more to me than you might think. All right, back to that night. The Harrington estate was exactly what I expected, and somehow still managed to shock me with its excess. The driveway alone stretched farther than some neighborhoods I'd lived in. The gates were forged iron trimmed with gold, because apparently plain iron wasn't grand enough to announce wealth. The lawn was manicured with obsessive precision, the kind that suggests someone measured each blade of grass and corrected it if it leaned the wrong way. As I guided my 10-year-old Honda CR-V up the immaculate drive, I caught my reflection in the rear-view mirror, minimal makeup, hair pulled into a low knot. My grandmother's small gold studs, the only jewelry I wore. I looked exactly like someone who didn't belong there. Perfect. Daniel met me at the door with a kiss that felt rehearsed, almost staged, like he was performing for an invisible audience. His eyes flicked quickly to my dress, my shoes, my bare wrists, and then I saw it, something I had never noticed before: embarrassment. He was embarrassed by how I looked. I tucked that realization away for later. Inside, the house was a shrine to new money desperately pretending to be old money. Crystal chandeliers in every room, oversized oil paintings and heavy gold frames prints. Not originals, though I doubted most guests could tell the difference. The furniture was expensive, stiff, and clearly chosen to impress rather than to be lived in. And there, standing in the foyer like a monarch surveying her domain, was Linda Harrington. She was in her early 60s, with the kind of face that suggested a long-standing relationship with very skilled cosmetic surgeons. Her blonde hair was styled into a flawless shell that likely required industrial-strength hairspray to survive the evening. Her dress was designer. Her jewelry was real. Her smile, however, was entirely manufactured. She extended her hand to me as if granting an audience. I took it and felt the limp handshake, the instant dismissal, the complete absence of warmth. Then she made that comment to Daniel, the one about me looking like the help. I smiled politely and pretended I hadn't heard a thing. The night was officially interesting. If I'd known what I was walking into, I might have worn armor instead of a navy dress. But I've always believed the best armor is information, and I had done my homework. The Harrington family owned a regional chain of car dealerships spread across 2 states. Not luxury brands, the kind you see in glossy magazines, but reliable, mid-range vehicles marketed to everyday families. Daniel's father, Richard Harrington, had inherited the business from his own father and spent decades expanding it. Linda married into the family at 24 and immediately began climbing the social ladder with ruthless precision. They had 2 children. Daniel, 35. My fiancé worked in marketing for a company completely unrelated to the family business, a fact that clearly disappointed Richard, who had always expected his son to take over the dealerships. And then there was Samantha, Daniel's older sister, 39 years old, and she treated the family fortune like an unlimited personal expense account. I knew all of this from public records, social media, and a few carefully placed searches. I'd seen the photos' lavish parties, charity galas, society events. I'd read the articles praising Linda's philanthropy, though a closer look revealed that most donations came with generous tax write-offs and flattering press coverage. None of that prepared me for meeting Samantha in person. She arrived 20 minutes late, which I would later learn was intentional. Being noticed mattered more to her than being respectful. She swept into the living room wearing a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. diamonds cascading from her ears and neck as if she'd fallen into a jewelry case and decided to keep everything she touched. When she finally acknowledged me, she offered exactly one word, "Hello, not nice to meet you. Not Daniel's told us so much about you. Just hello," delivered with all the warmth of frozen glass. Just hello, delivered with a faint curl of her lip, the kind that suggested she'd caught an unpleasant smell. I smiled and returned the greeting anyway. She immediately turned back to her mother, launching into a conversation that very deliberately excluded me, something about an upcoming charity luncheon, and whether the florist from last month's disaster had finally been fired. I stood there holding the glass of water someone had handed me, feeling about as welcome as a vegetarian at a steakhouse. Daniel lingered nearby, clearly uncomfortable and completely silent. That was the second note I mentally filed away. Richard Harrington, Daniel's father, was an entirely different presence. A big man, broad shoulders, heavy frame, the kind who had likely been athletic once. Before wealth softened the edges, he shook my hand with a grip meant to feel commanding, though it came across as tired. His eyes, however, were sharp. I noticed him watching me not with judgment, but with something closer to curiosity. There was another guest at dinner that evening, someone I hadn't expected, an older man introduced as a longtime family acquaintance and business associate, Arthur Collins. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, with a gaze that seemed to catalog everything it touched. When he shook my hand, his eyes lingered on my face for just a second too long. There was a flicker of recognition there. It unsettled me. Had we met before? Somewhere I couldn't quite place, I couldn't figure it out, and he didn't say a word, but throughout the evening, I caught him watching me with that same thoughtful, puzzled expression. Linda eventually guided us into the dining room. It looked like someone had been handed an unlimited budget and absolutely no sense of restraint. The table alone was long enough to host a small royal summit. The chairs were upholstered in what I assumed was real silk, and the place settings featured more cutlery than I'd ever seen outside of a catering warehouse. I counted 6 forks for one meal. I've seen operating rooms use fewer instruments. Linda noticed me looking and offered that familiar frozen smile. She said she imagined I wasn't very accustomed to formal dining. Her voice soaked in artificial sympathy. I replied calmly that my grandmother always said it wasn't the number of forks that mattered, it was the people you shared the meal with. Her smile tightened by a fraction of an inch. Samantha let out a short laugh into her wine glass. Dinner began. The first course was a soup I couldn't identify, though I was fairly certain it cost more per serving than my weekly grocery bill. Linda took this moment to begin what I would later think of as the interrogation. She asked where I grew up. I told her a small town in northern Oregon. True. She asked about my family. I said my grandmother raised me. Also true. She asked about my parents. I said they passed away when I was young. Linda made a sound that was meant to be sympathetic, but came out oddly mechanical. She commented on how difficult it must have been to grow up without proper guidance. I told her my grandmother had provided all the guidance I ever needed. Samantha leaned forward, her diamonds catching the chandelier light, and asked what my grandmother had done for a living. I said she'd been a businesswoman. Samantha's eyebrows lifted slightly. What kind of business? I smiled and said, small ventures, nothing particularly exciting, which was technically true, just not the whole truth. Linda moved on. She asked about my current job. I said I worked in tech. She asked if I was a secretary. I said my role was more supportive. Linda nodded as though this confirmed every assumption she'd already made. She commented that every organization needed good support staff. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat and still said nothing. That's when Samantha decided to change the subject. She casually dropped a name into the conversation. Emily, The name landed like a stone in still water, sending quiet ripples across the table. Samantha mentioned she'd run into Emily the week before, said she was doing wonderfully, that her family's company was thriving. I watched Daniel's face. Something flickered there too fast to fully read. Guilt, nerves, gone almost instantly. Linda seized the moment. She said Emily had always been such a lovely girl, so accomplished, so perfectly suited to their family's lifestyle. They dated for 3 years. She added, "Did I know that I said I didn't?" Linda smiled and said what a shame it was that things hadn't worked out. Everyone at that table behaved as though the outcome had already been decided, as if Daniel and Emily Foster had always been destined to end up together. Emily's family owned a luxury vehicle import firm, one that specialized in European brands and exclusive distribution deals, a perfect complement to the Harrington dealerships. The message didn't need to be spoken aloud. Emily had been the right choice. I was not. I glanced around the dining room and noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before: photographs. I turned slightly in my chair and saw an entire wall dedicated to framed family memories, holidays, birthdays, graduations, and in at least 4 of those photos, a striking dark-haired woman stood beside Daniel. Her arm looped through his, her smile effortless. "Emily!" Linda followed my gaze. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her satisfaction filled the room. Samantha, however, decided to sharpen the blade. She mentioned far too casually that Emily was still single, remarked on how surprising that was, almost as if she were waiting for something or someone. I turned back to the table and smiled. I said she sounded like an impressive woman. That was clearly not the reaction Samantha had expected. She blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Linda recovered quickly. She agreed Emily was impressive. And then, with all the subtlety of a falling brick, she added that she hoped I wouldn't feel too out of place in their world. Given my simpler background, I asked her what she meant by simple. Linda's smile sharpened. She explained that not everyone was born with certain advantages, that some people lived ordinary lives and worked ordinary jobs, and that there was no shame in being common. The word landed hard, but I kept my expression neutral. I had come here for answers, and I was getting them. Daniel finally spoke. He said his mother didn't mean anything by it, that she was just being protective. Linda patted his hand gently and said, "Of course she was protective. A mother always wanted the best for her son." The unspoken conclusion hung in the air like smoke. "And you are not the best." Richard cleared his throat. Attempting to shift the conversation, he asked about my interests, my hobbies. I said I enjoyed reading, hiking, cooking simple meals, nothing elaborate. Samantha laughed softly and said that was adorable, like a child listing favorite pastimes. That's when Arthur Collins, the family friend, spoke for the first time since dinner began. He said there was something deeply valuable about simple pleasures, that his own grandmother had lived modestly and had been the happiest person he'd ever known. Linda shot him a look sharp enough to curdle milk. Arthur ignored it. Instead, he looked directly at me and asked what my grandmother's name had been. I told him, Margaret Moore. His eyebrows lifted slightly. He didn't comment, just nodded once, thoughtfully, and returned to his soup. The rest of the meal followed the same pattern. Linda and Samantha took turns asking questions designed to remind me politely, relentlessly, of where they believed I belonged. Daniel made occasional half-hearted attempts to intervene, but there was no real conviction behind them. Richard stayed mostly silent, observing everything with the weary resignation of a man who had learned long ago that arguing with his wife was pointless. And throughout it all, Arthur watched me. By the time dessert arrived, I had learned everything I needed to know about the Harrington family. They measured human worth in money and connections. They saw me as an inconvenience. an error, a problem to be corrected. But I had learned something else, too. Something I hadn't expected. Daniel was not the man I thought he was. The version of him I'd fallen in love with was attentive, thoughtful, genuinely interested in who I was, but the man sitting beside me, now silent, while his family dismantled me piece by piece, was someone else entirely, someone weaker, someone who valued approval over integrity. I wondered which version was real. I was about to find out. After dessert, Linda announced we would have coffee in the sitting room. The men drifted toward the windows to talk business. Samantha excused herself to take a call. Linda mentioned she needed to speak with the house staff and would join us shortly. That left me alone, and it gave me an opportunity. I excused myself to find the restroom. Daniel pointed me down a long hallway lined with more art that looked expensive and utterly soulless. I walked slowly. The house was impressive on paper, but it felt hollow, like a museum curated for appearances, not for living. I found the bathroom easily, but I wasn't really looking for it. I was looking for clarity. And instead, I found something better. As I passed a partially open door, I heard voices, Linda's and Samantha's. I stopped. Every instinct told me to keep moving, to respect privacy, but something in Linda's tone, sharp, urgent, made me hesitate. I stayed in the shadows. Linda was saying they needed to handle the situation quickly, that Daniel couldn't be allowed to make this mistake. Samantha agreed. She said she couldn't believe he'd actually brought me there, that she'd assumed this was just a phase like his vegan phase in college. Linda said this was more serious. This woman could ruin everything. My heart started pounding. They were talking about me. Of course they were. But then Samantha said something that made my blood turn cold. She said the timing was disastrous, that the merger with the Foster family had to go through, and that Daniel needed to be with Emily for that to happen. The Foster family, the luxury importers. Linda agreed. She said the dealerships were struggling, that without the partnership, they wouldn't survive the next fiscal year. The floor shifted beneath me. I had suspected financial trouble. This confirmed it. Samantha continued. She said Daniel was supposed to keep Emily interested while they finalized the deal. That was the plan. The Foster family would invest. In exchange, they'd gain access to the Harrington distribution network. Linda said Daniel had assured her he was keeping his options open. Options. While proposing to me, I leaned against the wall, my thoughts racing. This wasn't just snobbery. This wasn't just a family who disapproved of their son's girlfriend. This was something else entirely. This wasn't accidental. It wasn't emotional. It was calculated. Daniel wasn't just a man too weak to stand up to his mother. Daniel was using me. But for what? If Emily had always been the plan, why keep me around at all? Samantha answered the question for me. She scoffed and said Daniel was an idiot, that he'd actually started liking this little office girl, this nobody. He was supposed to keep her around as a temporary distraction, a placeholder until the deal with Emily was finalized. But instead, he was getting attached, a placeholder. That was my role, something to occupy him while the family handled their real business. Linda said they would take care of it. She said they'd announce the engagement tonight, get Daniel publicly committed, and then find a way to end things quietly before the wedding. Once Emily was secured, they'd discover some unfortunate truth about me, something scandalous enough to justify calling it off. Samantha asked what that secret would be. Linda replied that they'd invent one if they had to. I stood frozen in that hallway, listening to two women plan the destruction of my life with the same tone one might use to organize a dinner party. Then Samantha made it worse. She laughed and said at least the girl was too stupid to suspect anything. That Daniel had chosen well in that sense. She was naive, grateful, probably amazed that someone like Daniel had even noticed her. Linda laughed with her. I stepped away from the door silently. My hands were shaking, but not from heartbreak, from anger. They thought I was stupid. They thought I was desperate. They thought I'd accept whatever scraps they tossed my way. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I found the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at my reflection. The woman looking back at me wasn't broken. She wasn't devastated. She was thinking, I had come here to test Daniel's family, and they had failed spectacularly. But the real revelation was this: Daniel himself was part of the deception. He wasn't trapped between me and his family. He was actively lying to me. Now the question was what to do about it. I could confront him, expose everything I'd heard, walk out and never look back. But that would be too easy. They'd dismiss me as emotional, overreacting. Exactly what they already believed me to be. No. If I was going to respond to this betrayal, I would do it my way. On my terms, with a plan they would never see coming. My grandmother used to say that when someone underestimates you, they hand you a gift, the gift of surprise. Linda and Samantha had just given me the greatest gift imaginable. They didn't know what I was capable of. I fixed my makeup, smoothed my hair, and walked back into the sitting room with a smile. The game had begun. When I returned, the room had subtly changed. The furniture had been rearranged, the lighting adjusted. Linda stood near the fireplace, barely able to hide her anticipation. Richard lingered near the doorway, visibly uneasy. Samantha pretended to admire a painting, though I caught her smirking at Daniel. And Daniel stood in the center of the room, nervous, too nervous. He turned when he saw me and smiled a smile meant to look loving. He took my hands and said he wanted to ask me something. I felt the trap tightening. Daniel spoke about how we hadn't been together long, how his family could be overwhelming. But he said he knew what he wanted. He said he wanted me. Then he dropped to one knee. The ring was large, flashy, exactly the kind Linda would approve of. Up close. Though, I noticed the flaws. The stone was cloudy, the setting slightly uneven, a ring designed to impress in low light but reveal its imperfections in the daylight. Much like the man holding it, Daniel asked me to marry him, behind him. Linda was practically glowing. This was the plan. Public commitment first, disposal later. In the meantime, they'd keep Emily waiting, dangling Daniel just long enough to finalize the business arrangement. I understood all of this in a single heartbeat, and I understood that I had a choice. I could say no, reject a man who was using me, leave with my dignity intact. But that would end the story too soon. I thought about the hallway, the lies, the way they'd laughed at me, and I thought about how satisfying it would be to prove them wrong. So I said yes. Daniel slid the ring onto my finger. Linda applauded as if she were watching a stage performance. Samantha offered congratulations with all the warmth of midwinter. Richard shook Daniel's hand and said he'd done well, across the room. Arthur Collins caught my eye. There was something knowing in his expression, as if he suspected this story wasn't finished yet. I smiled at him. He smiled back. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of champagne and fake smiles. Linda talked about engagement parties. Samantha debated venues. Richard mentioned business opportunities hesitantly, unsure what my family could possibly contribute. Daniel stayed close, playing the devoted fiancé with impressive conviction. If I hadn't heard the truth, I might have believed him. But I had heard it, and I would never forget. When the night finally ended, Daniel walked me to my car. The air was cold and sharp. He asked if I was okay, said he knew his family could be intense, but promised they'd warm up to me eventually. I told him I understood, that I was just tired. He kissed me goodnight. I drove away from the Harrington estate with his ring on my finger and a plan forming in my mind. The next morning, I began my research, because if there's one thing my career has taught me, it's this: information is power, data is leverage, and documentation changes everything. I spend my days breaking down systems, finding weak points, tracing patterns, identifying pressure lines no one else notices. I was about to apply those same skills to the Harrington family. And what I uncovered over the next several days didn't just confirm what I'd overheard, it went far beyond it. The Harrington dealerships weren't experiencing a temporary slowdown. They were in serious trouble. Rapid expansion during the boom years, aggressive borrowing, short-term growth at the expense of long-term stability. Now the debts were catching up. Their primary manufacturer contract was approaching renewal, and the automaker was quietly exploring alternatives. The potential partnership with Emily Foster's family wasn't strategic, it was necessary for survival. But that wasn't the worst part. As I kept digging, I found something the Harringtons clearly believed would never surface. Samantha had been siphoning money from the business. At first, the amounts were subtle, buried in expense reimbursements and discretionary accounts, but over time, the numbers added up, 6 figures. Quietly drained to support her lifestyle while the company struggled to stay afloat. I printed everything: financial statements, transaction records, internal filings. Then I started making calls. My grandmother's name still carried influence in certain circles. The people she'd worked with over decades remembered the Moore family with respect, and when I reached out, they listened. One connection led to another. Eventually, I reached someone who knew Arthur Collins well, and it turned out Arthur had his own history with the Harringtons. Years ago, they'd pushed him out of a business deal not illegally, just unethically enough to leave a permanent scar. He'd been waiting for an opportunity to balance the scales. I was about to give him one. Before I continue, let me say this honestly. This channel means more to me than you probably realize. Every like, every comment, every subscription truly helps. If you're enjoying the story, please take just a moment to hit that subscribe button. Thank you. Now back to what happened next. The following weeks became an exercise in discipline and performance. I played the role of the happy fiancé flawlessly. I attended family dinners at the Harrington estate, smiled through Linda's carefully disguised insults, watched Samantha parade designer clothes and jewelry, knowing exactly where the money had come from, and I watched Daniel, or rather, I finally saw him. The attentiveness I once found charming now felt calculated. The compliments sounded practiced. And his phone, guarded with increasing intensity, buzzed with messages he always hid, just a little too quickly. I knew who they were from. I'd seen the name flash on his screen more than once. Emily. One evening, I told Daniel I'd be working late. Instead, I parked across the street from the restaurant where he claimed he was meeting a client. He wasn't meeting a client. He was meeting her. I watched through the window as they sat close together at a corner table. Their body language said everything words didn't. At one point, he reached for her hand. At another, she laughed and touched his face. I took photos, not for legal reasons, but because I wanted to remember this moment clearly, to remember exactly who Daniel Harrington really was. He wasn't just weak. He wasn't just controlled by his family. He was a liar actively maintaining 2 relationships while others decided his future behind closed doors. The anger I felt was sharp and clarifying, but I didn't act. Not yet. I went home and added the photographs to my growing file. Arthur and I began meeting regularly, always quietly. He shared his own documentation, stories of partners burned, deals twisted just enough to stay technically clean. He was more than willing to help, but one evening, he asked me why. He said he understood his own reasons. He wanted to know mine. Was this revenge? I thought carefully before answering. I told him it wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. I said the Harringtons had spent their lives using money and status to control people, discarding anyone they considered expendable. They were raising Daniel to do the same, and they'd keep doing it long after I was gone. Someone needed to show them that wealth didn't equal immunity. Arthur nodded slowly. He said my grandmother would be proud. That's when I knew I was doing the right thing. The engagement party was scheduled for 3 weeks later, hosted at the Harrington estate. Every influential name in their industry invited. Linda treated it like a coronation. She had no idea what was coming. Those 3 weeks were spent preparing. I coordinated quietly with Arthur, made strategic calls, reached out to the automaker considering ending their contract. They were very interested in what I had to say. The night before the party, I gave Daniel one last chance. We were sitting in his apartment reviewing final details. I asked how he felt about us, about our future. He said he was excited, said he couldn't wait to marry me. I asked if there was anything he wanted to tell me, anything at all. He looked at me with those familiar blue eyes and said no. I asked about Emily. His face drained of color just for a second. He recovered quickly and said she was just an old friend. I nodded, and in that moment, I understood everything. Daniel would never tell the truth if lying served him better. He was his mother's son. The next evening, I chose a dress from my real wardrobe, not the modest version I'd worn to that first dinner. This one was elegant, tailored, worth more than everything Linda was wearing combined. I looked at myself in the mirror and smiled. It was time. The Harrington estate had been transformed. White tents across the lawn, crystal chandeliers glowing overhead, a string quartet near the fountain. Waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that cost more per bite than some people made in an hour. Linda had spared no expense. This wasn't a party. It was a declaration. I arrived in my usual Toyota Corolla, watching the valet struggle to reconcile it with the parade of luxury cars before me. One of them asked if I was with the catering staff. I smiled and handed him my keys. The walk toward the main tent felt like a runway. With every step, I shed the role I'd been playing, the grateful fiancé, the modest outsider. Tonight, I was myself. My dress was a deep emerald green, custom fitted by a designer whose name carried quiet authority. My jewelry was understated but unmistakable to anyone who understood quality. It was time to show the Harrington family exactly who they had underestimated. At my throat rested my grandmother's diamond pendant, a piece once appraised at a value higher than most cars in that driveway. On my wrist sat a limited edition watch, one of only 50 ever made worldwide. For 14 months, I had hidden who I was. Tonight, I was done hiding. The first person to notice wasn't anyone important, at least not on paper. She was a woman standing near the entrance of the main tent, someone's wife, someone's partner. She glanced at me once, then again, her brow furrowed. She leaned toward the man beside her and whispered something urgently. They both stared. I didn't slow down. The second person to notice was Richard Harrington. He was stationed near the bar, greeting guests with the practiced enthusiasm of a man fulfilling an obligation rather than enjoying it. When he saw me, his smile froze mid-performance. His eyes moved face, dress, jewelry, back to my face. Confusion replaced confidence. I wished him a good evening and thanked him for hosting such a beautiful event. He muttered something polite, still clearly trying to solve the problem standing in front of him. I moved on before he could ask questions. Inside the main tent were nearly 100 guests carefully selected, business partners, social climbers, longtime acquaintances. I recognized several from my research. A regional executive from the auto manufacturer, 2 rival dealership owners, a journalist from the local business journal, and there, Commanding attention near the champagne fountain stood Linda Harrington. She wore a cream-colored gown that had likely cost a small fortune, though anyone with a trained eye could tell it was off the rack. Her jewelry sparkled impressively by everyday standards, but not by the standards of real wealth. She was laughing at something a guest had said, her head tilted back in that perfectly practiced way, the kind of laugh learned, not felt. She hadn't seen me yet. I accepted a glass of champagne and moved through the crowd, pausing to introduce myself to several guests along the way. Every interaction followed the same rhythm, a moment of confusion, surprise when I mentioned I was Daniel's fiancé, then renewed confusion when my appearance, my manner, and my presence didn't align with whatever story they'd been told about me. Whispers began to ripple outward, side glances, subtle phone checks, quiet recalculations. Good. I reached Linda's circle just as she finished recounting a story about her recent charitable efforts. She turned to greet me with her familiar frozen smile, and then her face changed. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally something else, something close to fear. She said my name as though testing it aloud. I smiled and wished her a good evening, thanking her for hosting such a lovely party. Her eyes darted across me, cataloging everything the dress worth more than her monthly household budget. The pendant she'd likely seen featured in a jewelry magazine, the watch she'd only ever encountered in advertisements. She asked where I'd gotten everything. Her voice was steady, but the tremor underneath betrayed her. I told her they were simply pieces I'd been saving for the right occasion. Samantha appeared beside her almost instantly, drawn by some unspoken signal. Her expression followed the same path: confusion, recognition, shock. But she recovered quickly. She commented on my dress, calling it interesting, her tone coated in artificial sweetness. She asked if it was a rental. I calmly told her the designer's name. I mentioned he was a friend, someone who'd made it specifically for me. The name hit her like a physical blow. This was a designer who dressed celebrities, someone with a waiting list measured in years, someone who didn't create custom gowns for office girls. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. I excused myself to find Daniel. As I walked away, I heard Linda hiss something to Samantha, demanding answers. I heard Samantha reply, confused, insisting none of this made sense. I smiled to myself and kept walking. Phase 1 was complete. The doubt had been planted. Now it was time to let it grow. Daniel found me first. He emerged from a knot of guests near the bar, his face pale, eyes wide. He'd clearly heard the whispers, seen the stares, tried and failed to reconcile the woman standing before him with the woman he thought he knew. He asked what was happening. He asked where the dress came from, the jewelry, the change. He asked why I looked like a completely different person. I met his gaze calmly. I look like myself, I said. He stared at me, and behind his eyes, I saw at the first fracture in a carefully constructed illusion, not understanding yet, just the beginning of it. Like the first crack in a wall that had been hiding an inconvenient truth. He asked if we could speak somewhere private. I smiled and told him. Later, I reminded him that this was, after all, our engagement party and that we had guests to greet. Before he could object, I slipped my hand through his arm and guided him toward a nearby group. These weren't social acquaintances. These were the people who actually controlled the automotive market in our region. Executives, dealership owners, industry decision-makers. The very people whose opinions determined whether the Harrington Group survived or collapsed. They'd already been watching my arrival with open curiosity. I introduced myself properly this time. I gave my full name, Ella Graham, and mentioned my role at my firm. I watched the shift happen in real time. Eyes sharpened, postures straightened, recognition sparked. A silver-haired man who owned a competing dealership chain smiled and said he'd heard of me. He mentioned that his nephew worked in tech and had spoken highly of my work on advanced systems integration. I thanked him politely. Another guest, a woman who specialized in mergers and acquisitions for a major investment firm, tilted her head and asked if I was related to Margaret Graham. I told her she was my grandmother. Her eyebrows rose instantly. She said my grandmother had been a force, a visionary, someone whose name still carried influence in serious financial circles. I felt Daniel stiffen beside me. He had no idea what any of this meant. He'd never asked real questions about my background, only the shallow ones. He had assumed that quiet meant insignificant. That assumption was now unraveling. As the evening moved forward, the truth traveled faster than champagne. People whispered. Phones appeared. Details were checked. The narrative was shifting under the Harrington family's feet, and they didn't know how to stop it. About an hour into the party, Thomas Reed found me near the Rose Garden. Daniel had been pulled away by his father for what looked like a tense conversation. Thomas told me the manufacturer's regional representative was present. More than that, he was interested. Very interested. The documents Thomas had shared earlier in the week had caught his attention. I asked if he was ready. Thomas smiled and said he'd been ready for a long time. We spoke briefly, finalizing what would come next. Then he disappeared back into the crowd. I returned to playing the role of the glowing fiancé. Linda Harrington cornered me moments later. She'd regained some of her composure, but the tightness around her eyes betrayed her. She took my arm too firmly and pulled me aside. She demanded to know what I was doing. I asked her to clarify. She snapped that I knew exactly what she meant. The dress, the jewelry, the stories, the way I'd been speaking about my grandmother, about my work. She wanted to know what my angle was. I told her there was no angle. I told her I was simply being myself. She said that was impossible. She said Daniel had told her everything about me, that I was an assistant, that I lived in a tiny apartment, that I drove a car barely fit for the road. I replied calmly that Daniel had made assumptions. I'd never actually said any of those things. Her face went completely still. I explained that I worked in tech, true, that my role supported development teams, also true. I reminded her that architects do support the system. I told her I had never claimed to be poor. I had simply never corrected anyone who assumed I was. She asked why. I met her gaze and said, "My grandmother always said you don't truly know someone until they believe no one important is paying attention." I told her I'd wanted to understand who the Harrington family really was. Her color drained. I told her I had my answer. Before she could respond, the music stopped. The string quartet fell silent. Charles Harrington's voice came over the sound system, announcing it was time for speeches and toasts. Linda looked at me not with anger this time, but with something closer to fear. I smiled and walked toward the stage. The platform stood at the far end of the tent, dressed in soft lights and flowers meant to suggest romance. Instead, it felt like a spotlight waiting to expose something. Charles welcomed the guests, thanking them for attending such a meaningful occasion. He spoke about family, tradition, strong partnerships in business and in life. His eyes kept flicking toward Linda as she moved purposefully through the crowd. She reached the microphone just as he finished. She took over effortlessly. Buzzed, list, perfect. She spoke of her pride in her son, of welcoming a new woman into the family, of the future. Then she shifted. She began talking about growth, expansion, new partnerships, strategic alliances. She hinted at an upcoming transformation, an exciting new chapter for the Harrington dealerships. I noticed the manufacturer's representative shift uncomfortably. Across the tent, Thomas Reed caught the man's eye and gave a subtle nod. Linda was building toward something. This engagement party wasn't just a celebration, it was a pitch. And finally, she called Daniel to the stage. Daniel stepped onto the stage, visibly tense, despite the smile he tried to wear. He positioned himself beside his mother and scanned the crowd until his eyes found me. Relief crossed his face, then uncertainty. Linda cleared her throat and announced that there was one more person who belonged on that stage. She said she wished to welcome her future daughter-in-law, the woman who had, in her words, captured her son's heart. She said my name. The entire tent turned toward me. I placed my champagne glass down and walked forward. The sound of my heels echoed through the silence. No music, no chatter, just attention. Everyone sensed it. This wasn't just an engagement party anymore. This was about to become something else entirely. I climbed the steps and stood beside Daniel. He reached for my hand, but his grip hesitated, unsteady, questioning. Linda handed me the microphone with a smile that looked rehearsed rather than sincere. She said she was sure I'd like to say a few words. I looked at the microphone. I looked at Daniel. I looked at Linda, who still believed she was in control. Then I looked out at the crowd, at the investors, the executives, the people who determined the fate of the Harrington Automotive Group. I nodded. Yes, I said calmly. I would like to say a few words. I began by thanking Linda for her hospitality. I thanked the Harrington family for the insight they'd given me over the past few weeks. Linda's smile faltered just slightly. I continued. When I first visited this home, I made a choice. I said, I chose to show you a simplified version of myself. I explained that I had deliberately arrived without designer labels, without titles, without the markers of status they valued so deeply. I said I wanted to see how I would be treated as someone they believed had nothing to offer them, someone they thought couldn't help them, someone they considered, in Linda's own words, ordinary. The color drained from her face. I described that first dinner, being compared unfavorably to an ex-girlfriend. The comments delivered softly enough to sound polite, but sharp enough to wound, being referred to as the help, as a gold digger, as someone beneath notice. Daniel stared at me now, frozen. Then I told them there was more. I explained that I had overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear. I described standing in a hallway, listening as Linda and her daughter Caroline Harrington discussed how to remove me from Daniel's life. I revealed that I'd learned the truth, that I was nothing more than a placeholder, a distraction, someone meant to occupy Daniel, while the family finalized his real future with Isabella Romano, the woman whose family owned Romano Imports. A murmur swept through the crowd. I continued, I also learned. I said that Harrington Automotive isn't thriving the way it claims. I explained that the company was over-leveraged, that its expansion had been reckless, that it was facing the loss of its primary manufacturer contract. I said the proposed partnership with the Romano family wasn't strategic, it was desperate. Charles Harrington's face had turned a dull shade of gray. Then I raised my phone. I displayed a photograph on the screen. Daniel and Isabella seated together at a restaurant, hands intertwined, intimate, unmistakable. I told the crowd the photo had been taken 2 weeks earlier on a night Daniel had told me he was working late. Whispers exploded. Daniel grabbed my arm and hissed that this wasn't what it looked like. I said softly that I'd already given him the chance to explain, that he'd chosen to lie. I turned back to the crowd. I'm not finished, I said. The silence returned instantly. Everyone understood now they were witnessing something rare. The social rules had collapsed. Truth had taken the stage. I explained that I'd spent weeks reviewing public records, financial filings, and internal data tied to Harrington Automotive. I listed the declining sales, the unpaid obligations, the looming termination notices. Then I looked toward the back of the tent, toward Caroline. She stood frozen, her expression empty. I said that while researching the company, I discovered something far more serious, that Caroline Harrington had been siphoning money from the business for years. Small amounts at first, hidden in expense reports, buried in reimbursement accounts. But over time, The total had grown. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Caroline screamed that I was lying. She accused me of trying to destroy their family. Before I could respond, Thomas Reed stepped forward. He carried a thick folder. Inside were bank statements, transaction logs, audit summaries, years of proof. He handed the folder to the manufacturer's regional director, who had moved closer to the stage, his expression grim, resigned. Thomas spoke clearly. He said the Harringtons had wronged him years ago, not illegally, but unethically. He said when I approached him with evidence of ongoing misconduct, he'd been more than willing to help. Linda finally found her voice. She threatened lawsuits, defamation, consequences. I met her gaze and said calmly that she was free to try. Everything I'd shared was documented, verifiable, publicly accessible. I reminded her that truth didn't fear investigation. I said the evidence of Caroline Harrington's financial misconduct had been compiled from sources that would stand up in any court of law. I turned to Daniel, who was still standing beside me, pale and hollow, like a man watching the last structure of his life collapse in real time. Then I said there was one final thing. I lifted my hand and slowly removed the engagement ring. Under the lights, the stone revealed what it really was: cloudy, uneven, imperfect, just like the promise it represented. I said I would not be marrying Daniel Harrington. I said I never truly intended to. Not after learning who he was. Not after learning what his family was capable of. I explained that the only reason I had accepted his proposal was to give them time enough to expose themselves. I placed the ring back into Daniel's hand. I told him he should give it to Isabella Romano. She was clearly the woman he had wanted all along. Daniel's face crumpled. He said that wasn't fair. He said he had feelings for me. He said Isabella had only been business, something his mother had orchestrated. I said quietly that was the problem. I said he had allowed his mother to arrange his relationships, his priorities, his future. I said he had never once defended me when his family demeaned me. I said he had lied to my face even when I gave him the chance to be honest. And I said a man who couldn't be truthful with the woman he claimed to love was not a man I would ever marry. The silence was absolute. I faced the crowd one last time. I said my name. I said I was a senior software architect, that I had built my career through discipline, ethics, and skill. I said I earned more in a single month than many people earned in a year, and that I chose to live simply because my grandmother had taught me that wealth was not the same as worth. I said the Harringtons had shown me exactly who they were, people who measured human value by balance sheets and last names, people who mistook humility for weakness. I said that kind of character always destroys itself whether or not anyone helps it along. I set the microphone down, and I walked off the stage. The crowd parted without a word. No one tried to stop me. Behind me, the evening unraveled. I heard Linda Harrington's voice rise sharp, desperate, trying to explain, to minimize, to regain control, but control was gone. I heard the manufacturer's regional director speaking into his phone. I heard guests murmuring, leaving early, distancing themselves from what they had just witnessed. At the edge of the tent, I paused. Caroline was arguing with her husband, frantic, pleading. He stared at her like she was a stranger. Charles Harrington sat slumped in a chair, hands covering his face, the weight of everything he had ignored finally pressing down. And Daniel stood alone on the stage, the rejected ring still in his hand. I didn't wait to see what expression followed. Outside, the night air felt clean, lighter. Thomas Reed joined me near the fountain. He said it was done. The manufacturer had already made the decision. Harrington Automotive would lose its franchise by the end of the month. I asked if he felt satisfied. He said no. He said it felt like closure, like a long overdue reckoning. I went home. I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The next morning, a headline appeared: Harrington Automotive Group faces closure. Following franchise termination, the article spoke of financial mismanagement, of ethical concerns, of internal investigations. It did not mention me, exactly as I had asked. Daniel texted later. He said he wanted to explain. I deleted the message. Some doors are not meant to be reopened. That morning, I stood by my window as sunlight filled the city. My grandmother's pendant rested against my skin. She had taught me that character reveals itself when no one thinks it matters, and that self-respect is the one thing no one can take from you unless you hand it over. I got ready for work. My real work. My real life. The Harringtons would face consequences, but that was no longer my story. Mine was just beginning. If this story meant something to you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for being here. See you in the next story.